Welcome to the Two Testaments, a guided journey through Scripture with leading experts on the Bible. Hosted by Ronnie Cosman and Will Kynes. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts or at the2testaments.com, where you can also donate to support our work. Follow us on Twitter at the2testaments on Facebook or Instagram.
Welcome to the Two Testaments, a guided journey through Scripture. I'm Will Kynes.
And I'm Ronnie Cosman.
In this episode, we're looking at Matthew 18:1 through 20:28, where we find a number of things, including what children teach us about the kingdom of heaven, sin and forgiveness, marriage and divorce, and the parables of the lost sheep and the laborers of the vineyard. There's a lot here, and so we're grateful to have Dr. Nathan Eubank with us to walk us through all of this in this passage.
Dr. Nathan Eubank is the Reverend John A. O'Brien Associate Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. He has written interesting articles and an important book on economic language in the Gospel of Matthew in particular, though his interests and writings span the New Testament. One article, for instance, is Prison, Penance, or Purgatory, the interpretation of Matthew 5:25 to 26 and parallels. Another one, Storing Up Treasure with God in the Heavens, Celestial Investments in Matthew. And this fascinating book, Wages of Cross-Bearing and Debt of Sin, the Economy of Heaven in Matthew's Gospel. And, we brought him on because Matthew has a lot of this economic language. And actually, as I was going through this section in particular, Matthew 18 through 20, there's quite a bit of this economic language that we might often just gloss over and not think about the significance of it. And I think actually it has some interesting, potentially theological implications, yes. Especially because, certain Christian traditions, of course, would be really reticent to the idea of wages, right, in terms of inheriting the kingdom of heaven. So I'm really glad to have Nathan on here to help us think through a lot of that.
Yeah, so thanks for joining us, Nathan.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. I'm a fan of the podcast.
Great, we love to hear that. Well, let's start by hearing a little bit about what drew you to this theme of economics in the New Testament and then the Gospel of Matthew in particular.
Yeah, so I think it was Matthew first. My first year as a PhD student, I took a seminar with Richard Hayes on Matthew. That's when he was working on Echoes of Scripture and the Gospels stuff. And I just fell in love with it. I thought this is a lot weirder and more exciting than I thought. First book of the New Testament, who would have guessed? I'm interested in everything. I tend to fall in love with whatever I'm reading at the time. So as you mentioned, I don't just do Matthew, but yeah, I think it was that seminar with the economic stuff. It was just reading Matthew over and over. I started to notice that there was a lot there. Of course, there's a lot there in Christian and Jewish texts generally, but it seemed like there's more in Matthew. And I just realized my whole life I'd never noticed it. Even in that seminar actually with Richard Hayes, I went that whole semester and never noticed any of it. And you can read a whole commentary and no one says anything about it. And I started digging into the literature, really trying to see what had been said. I noticed, especially if you go back a generation or two, clear concerted efforts to downplay it, usually in favor of Kantian, I have Kantian expert friends who tell me this isn't correct. But New Testament scholars of yesteryear thought that Kant taught that reward is its own virtue. And so if there's any kind of repayment for good deeds, it makes virtue impossible. And older commentators used to just sort of take that for granted, like, oh, obviously that's correct. So how are we going to fix Matthew? And so I thought, okay, well, I just need to dig into this because it hasn't been given its.
Great. Could you briefly summarize what is going on here in Matthew 18:1 through 20, verse 28?
Sure. So in chapter 18, Jesus talks a lot. So if you have a red letter Bible, it's mostly red. He's talking mostly about what we would call the church or the ecclesia. And then in 19 and 20, the narrative continues to move forward toward Jerusalem, and Jesus talks about a number of things that maybe aren't related at first glance. So, marriage, children, greatness, money. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Right. So, how do you see this section here fitting into the Gospel of Matthew as a whole?
So we have two ways of talking about this, depending on whether you're just like looking at Matthew by itself, or if you're reading Matthew synoptically along with Mark, which I take to be one of Matthew's sources. So if we, reading it alongside with Mark, like Mark, for Matthew, this is part of an important section of the gospel after Jesus has started talking about his death and resurrection and the corresponding way of life set out for anyone who would follow him. Matthew, that's chapter 16. And before he's actually gone to Jerusalem to die. And so in this material in between, there's a tendency to talk about the same kinds of issues over and over, which seems to me to be a way of reflecting on the meaning of the cross, of Jesus' cross and resurrection, and what that means for the disciples. So in this section of Matthew and Mark, there are repeated passion and resurrection predictions, of course, lots of arguments about who's the greatest or what greatness means.
Yeah.
And you also get, children, money, things like that. I think all of these are different ways of taking cross-bearing. So Jesus says not only that he is to die on a cross, but they are to bear their crosses. What does that mean? Does that literally mean that all of Jesus' followers get crucified? I think it raises questions of sort of status, what counts, what makes someone a great disciple, and so that's why these same issues come up again and again. It seems to me, issues like and we'll talk about children in a bit, but I think that's a great example of this. If we're just looking at Matthew, if we didn't have the Mark, what we would say is this is one of Matthew's huge blocks of teaching material. So it's worth mentioning that too. Matthew loves to have Jesus just talk on and on and on and on. And this is the fourth one of 5. And it's often called, in chapter 18, it's often called the Discourse on the Church. That's worth mentioning too.
Great. Now, in this stretch of text, what do you find most challenging for yourself to kind of grasp and understand?
There's always, whenever you dig into anything, this is why I like the Bible. Whenever you dig into anything, everything's confusing, actually, It's almost the opposite of what I thought before I started doing this for a living. I thought, that must be really boring because probably everyone knows what everything says already. If I had to pick one in this section, I would say the porneia or fornication, however you translate it, exception clause in the teaching on marriage and divorce in chapter 18. There's a parallel to that also in Matthew 5. Jesus seems to have prohibited divorce. We see it in Mark, Luke, 1 Corinthians, and then Matthew throws in this clause, which is confusing in every way. It doesn't fit my idea of Matthew. Matthew seems to be quite conservative with his sources, and he's adding this thing that seems to make a big difference. Does it mean that divorce and remarriage are prohibited in cases of adultery or something like that? Does it mean that separation or divorce is required? That's another possibility. Does it mean that separation or divorce is prohibited but not remarriage? If you look at the secondary literature on this, it's all over the place. The syntax is difficult, and I've spent some time with it, and I don't think I'm ever going to know what I think. So,
okay, great.
So don't ask me about it anymore. No, just
we might poke at it a little bit. Okay. In chapter 18, the disciples ask Jesus, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And Jesus responds with an object lesson, right? He calls for a child and tells the disciples, "Unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." How do children here inform Jesus's instruction of what the disciples must do to enter the kingdom of heaven?
So I think the question here is one of status. It begins at the beginning of 18. The disciples ask, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And that's why Jesus grabs a child. And as I suggested earlier, I think the question of status comes up naturally when the person they take to be, the Lord or the Christ has announced to him that he's to be crucified, which is it's a public way in Roman punishment that you could illustrate someone's complete lack of status, maybe along with mocking their attempts at attaining a kind of status.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the kind of macro structure. That's what's in the background. And the disciples come and say, who is the greatest? And so then Jesus grabs a child and doesn't just say, and he ups the ante. It's not just that you need to become like a child to be great. So you need to become like a child to enter the kingdom at all. You'll never enter the kingdom unless you become like a child. So the question then, your good question is, what do children signify here? Mm-hmm. In religious art, I think sometimes maybe this is a little bit distracting for people who've grown up around Christian-y stuff. Children can represent all kinds of different things. It's sort of romantic, maybe someone who's free of culture, someone who's innocent, cherubic. I don't think any of that is in play here. I think it's pretty clear that we're dealing with children as low status, humble, but lowly, because that's what the passage is about. It's not say lack of experience or something like that. I think it's about lowliness. So children are in the synoptic tradition, especially in Matthew, you might say like an icon or an image of the cross or cruciformity. And they come up again and again, surprisingly, especially in Matthew. So when Jesus enters the temple in chapter 21, he's praised by children who cry out. People who witness this grow angry, but Jesus quotes a psalm to explain why this should be. Or in chapter 19, in a bit, Jesus says that the kingdom belongs to children. At the end of chapter 11, Jesus says that he praises his Father for revealing these things to children and not to the wise. In that case, probably referring to figurative children, not literal children. So I think that's why they appear here. It's the child is like an image of what every disciple must become to enter the kingdom. But I think for Matthew, that's also an image of Jesus himself.
That is striking because I think in our culture, children are given a very high status. And so it's hard for us to connect to this message that children are being used to communicate. So we hold children up on this kind of pedestal in some ways. And maybe that's where these ideas of innocence and so forth get connected with children. But what Jesus is actually saying is it's a humiliating image, potentially. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think the way that what a child signifies is so different for us. It becomes pretty.
I mean, even in contemporary culture, sometimes you will hear the kind of sentiment expressed that, children are dumb, right? Or they're not intellectually formed, right? They're kind of they're immature, right? The immaturity of a child, which I mean,
if someone says, "Don't be a child," right? That's what they're getting.
That's right. So I mean, we have some of that as well, but I think your point is more of the social status. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. That they're lowly. They're not great. There's nothing impressive about them. So maybe for us, the closest analogy would be how we feel about children on airplanes.
Okay, now Jesus does something interesting because he not only says in verse 4, whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. He then in verse 5 says, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. Could you elaborate a little bit on, there seems to be a bit of a pivot there, is there, between being like a child and then welcoming one who's of low status?
Yeah, I think there is a bit of a pivot there. So this picks up on another motif in Matthew's gospel, which is sometimes called the Emmanuel motif. That Jesus is God with us. So Matthew begins with that. He will be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. It ends with Jesus promising to be with his disciples until the end of the age. He says a little bit later that when 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, he is there with them. And so there's this idea that Jesus is present with the disciples always. And one way where that happens specifically, that comes up again and again, is he's present in certain people, especially the lowly. So the most famous example of this by far, I think, is in chapter 25 with the sheep and the goats, where the nations are told whenever they helped the prisoners and the naked and the hungry and so on, they were actually serving Jesus, the Son of Man. But in chapter 10, the missionary discourse, he says that anyone who helps the people he sends out to preach, that they're really receiving him, and they're called little ones there also. They're described in childlike terms. So I think here welcoming a child is closely analogous to, say, welcoming a humble disciple or welcoming a beggar, someone in need. Children, those lowly people are, like as I said earlier, they are sort of images of Christ, I think, in Matthew.
So after speaking to the importance of welcoming children in Jesus' name, Jesus then discusses the consequences that fall on those who cause one of these little ones who believe in me to sin. That's verse 6. He says in verse 7, it would be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depths of the sea. So what does Jesus mean here when he warns us against causing one of the little ones to sin?
Hey, great question. So probably we've switched here from literal children to humble disciples, though for Matthew it would include actual children. I mean, Matthew thinks that children believe in Jesus, as you see in chapter 21 when Jesus is in the temple. So whether it's children or humble disciples, causing them to sin would be a persistent concern of Matthew is the fallibility, defectibility of disciples. And that in the ecclesia or in the church, in the group of people who appear to be followers of Jesus, some might not make it. Some might not endure to the end. You see this, for example, in Matthew's explanation of the parable of the sower in chapter 13, or later in this chapter, he talks a lot about disciples who sin. Matthew 24 and 25 talks about different kinds of servants, some who are faithful, others who are not faithful. So here we're dealing with the problem of one disciple maybe causing another to fall away in this way that Matthew's worried about. This could happen, and so if we're to scale, like, what would this actually mean in practice? If all we have to go on is Matthew, you see chapter 23 when he's talking about scribes and Pharisees. There could just be a bad example. So you could have a teacher or someone in authority who just doesn't behave well. And so that would be an example. Matthew's worried about people who confess outwardly but lack obedience. You see that in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 7, for example. So that would be another one. Another would be, say, Peter. Peter attempts to cause Jesus to sin, to draw him away in chapter 16 when he tries to convince him not to go the way of the cross. So I think all of those, saying bad things, teaching bad things, acting in a bad way is probably what Matthew has in mind.
Now, after Jesus, cautions against causing one of these little ones to sin, he then continues and says it would be better to cut off a hand or a foot or tear out an eye, which might cause you to sin. So now it seems like he's almost, I don't know if he's switched from causing someone else to sin to preventing some body part in yourself from causing you to sin. It would be better to remove that body part or tear it out because it's better to enter life missing body parts instead of entering eternal fire with the whole body intact. What is Jesus communicating here with this kind of grisly and gory exhortation?
Well, Matthew and the synoptic tradition in general, but I think especially Matthew, loves the grisly, the gory, the fantastic, over the top, the grotesque. Camels through eyes of needle, weeping, gnashing of teeth. So just beams in eyes. Whole but stuck in your eye. So this is typical of Matthew, and I think it comes up here probably with a kind of catchword association with the word that we're translating as cause to sin. So he just talked about, don't be a cause to sin to someone else. Now, as you said, he switches to talking about your own body causing you to sin. So I think what we have here is a sort of a fantastic or over the top and exaggerated way of saying, stop at nothing to eliminate causes of sin in yourself. He says something similar in the context of adultery in chapter 5. So just don't let anything get in the way. Do what you have to do.
Right, cut off if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off there. Yeah, that's right.
So this is not intended to be in any way a literal command from Jesus.
I don't think he probably is advocating mutilation here. The Bible and the biblical tradition is so weird. It's worth seriously entertaining. But no, I think
have people in the history of the church tried to apply this? I mean, I think I remember a story about Origen. There's some debate about whether he actually tries to apply this literally.
Yeah, I don't think he actually did. Is it Eusebius who says that? I don't know offhand. I think Eusebius maybe suggests this, and then most Origen scholars. I know I've heard smart Origen scholars assure me that he didn't actually capture it himself.
Okay. All right. So we don't need to worry about that. Good. I'm glad we've cleared that up. Let's move on then. So Jesus then tells this parable about the lost sheep and how God is a shepherd who leaves the 99 to rescue the one sheep that went astray. And it's striking the way that he puts it, because he says, what do you think, in verse 12? If a shepherd has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? It's a kind of rhetorical question.
Which I want to say, no, he doesn't.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like I would expect the people to say, oh, yes, obviously. That's what he does. So explain to us the logic of the parable here and how it communicates its message.
Yeah, it's a good question. So if a shepherd was a hired hand, which they often were, it's possible. I don't think we have unequivocal evidence from like documentary papyri or ancient contracts and receipts and stuff on this. But I think it's possible that if a certain number of sheep were entrusted, like if I own the sheep and I entrusted them to you, that I would expect after the end of a certain amount of time to get them all back, and maybe you'd be on the hook financially for any that were damaged or lost. I think to summarize a lot of stuff, I think that's not crazy. I think that's possible. Similarly, if you were the owner, John's gospel makes this point explicitly. You might be even more concerned if they were your sheep. That's valuable property. You wouldn't lost. So if going after the one means leaving the other 99 to get lost, that doesn't seem right. But I do think it's plausible that if you could leave them in the care of someone else, isn't the old story, and I never know what to believe about these stories, about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think was allegedly a situation like this, where somebody was going after one sheep. So that's what I would do. Like if one of my children were to go missing, I'd say forget about the other ones. They're fine, or leave them with somebody else, and then I'm going to go all over the place looking for the one. So actually, I don't think. I think maybe this is a plausible scenario.
Yeah, it depends. So it depends on how you reconstruct the scenario. If the scenario is one where you leave the 99 unattended, then it's...
But then that's striking, because I think the way this parable is often interpreted is to demonstrate the gratuitous nature of God's love, that he goes after the one. But it's just the way that a shepherd would act.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, and of course, the Lucan parallel is lodged with a bunch of other passages that might push it more in the direction of gratuity. Here, I think probably the point would be less that, isn't it amazing that God would do this extraordinary thing, but more that these people who have fallen away are not just lost, but there's actually, in a sense, a greater priority on them.
Yeah, so you could take even the same parable and understand it in different ways based on the context that it comes in the gospel, and so different aspects could be emphasized.
Yeah, and it seems like the point in here for Matthew is that when and if he finds it, truly I tell you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. It's kind of demonstrating
so
how
you get some of the gratuity there.
Yeah, how excited God is to rescue one. It brings him a lot of joy. And then verse 14, so it is not the will of your Father in heaven that one of these little ones should be lost. So he's really concerned even about the single lost one.
Yeah.
Which is, yeah. It seems when Jesus tells this parable in verses 12 to 13, he still has in mind the little ones, right, that he discussed earlier in verse 6. Here he says in verse 10, to take care that you do not despise one of these little ones, since in heaven their angels continually see the face of my Father in heaven. Who are these angels? And does this mean that children, or those who have become children, have guardian angels? And what is the function of these angels?
It's a great question. This is a really interesting passage, and I suspect this is the main biblical source of the idea of guardian angels. Just because Matthew's been so popular in the church. I doubt that it's Tobit that primarily inspired it. So we have a shift here from warning against causing little ones to sin to despising them. So thinking of them as perhaps as low status as in fact that they are. So there's a kind of reevaluation of worth that stretches back to verse 1 of chapter 18. And the way that Matthew does this is by, as Matthew often does, is by contrasting kind of heavenly and earthly reality. I know you had Jonathan Pennington as a guest. I don't know if you got into this with him. He has a great book on heaven and earth in Matthew's gospel. And the way this motif functions, he argues, and I think he's exactly right, is Matthew likes to draw attention to the differences between the way things are in our normal reality and the heavenly reality, or the reality in the heavens. It's usually plural. And so, like, for example, in the Lord's Prayer, disciples are taught to pray that the heavenly reality would be executed or done here on earth. And in this example, that means, whereas on earth, children are of low status and they're annoying, too loud. They don't let me read. In heaven, they have an angelic representative continually beholding, the unseeable God, and so that kind of that flips things around. So actually, the heavenly reality is they have this, there's a kind of greatness. Of course, again, I'm not losing sight of the fact that here we're dealing not just maybe with literal children, but with humble disciples, with little ones. Now so that much to me is clear. Here's the weird part, in my opinion, or maybe the surprising part. Are these guardian angels here? It doesn't sound like it to me. It doesn't sound like an angel, say, sent to help, like in Tobit, or to send a message, like in Luke 1, or Daniel. Here we have an angel. If anything, it almost looks like it's the other way. It's like from the child to God, like perhaps an intercessor. On the I keep saying child, on the little one's behalf, something like that. So I don't think it quite fits our image of a guardian angel. Does that?
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you?
It's not guarding them. It's not like the angel It's a Wonderful Life that comes down and fixes George Bailey's life. The angel's focus is on God, not on the child on earth. Yeah, that's what you're pointing out. So it's continually holding the face of the Father.
Sorry. Yeah, it describes them as their angels. So in some sense, they belong to the little ones. And the connection between them is close enough that Jesus uses it as a rationale for not thinking lightly of the little ones.
Yeah. So let me press a little bit here, because right after he talks about the angels continually see the face of my Father in heaven, he then asks, what do you think? If a shepherd has 100 sheep, and one of them has gone astray, and he tells this parable of the lost sheep. So what's the connection here? I'm trying to find a connection between these angels who are, maybe you don't like the language of guardian, but they have some connection to the little ones. And if the little ones are despised, it seems like that's going to cause them to maybe be like the one sheep that goes astray. And is this where the angel kind of functions as an intercessor who says, hey, God the Father, you need to go get that angel that's gone astray and go rescue it? Is that kind of what's going on? The other thing I was wondering is, and I don't think it comes out this way, but angels as executioners. So it's kind of like, don't despise one of these little ones, or else, these angels are going to basically summon God the Father to act as kind of, to judge you and bring vindication. But here it seems like at least the way it shifts to the parable of the lost sheep, it's like the angels are almost summoning the Father to go rescue the sheep. I mean, what do you
I really like that suggestion, as is so often the case in the Synoptics, in the Synoptic Gospels. A lot hinges on the extent to which we read a section as tightly woven together and mutually illuminating, as opposed to a kind of a grab bag of Jesus sayings that Matthew wanted to get. In contrast, say, to John, if you ever read John, there's no question that it's all kind of together. It represents a unified vision of what Jesus wants to say. Whereas at times in the Synoptic Gospels, in all three of them, especially in teaching material, you think, okay, do these sayings go together, or are they sort of loosely associated by cognate ideas or key words?
Yeah.
I think so. In general, I tend to think the synoptics are more coherent than scholars often give them credit for. Coherent in the sense that, like, you're really meant to read them from beginning to end, and everything's mutually interpreting. And I quite like that suggestion. Like, don't despise them. I mean, maybe we could even add, don't despise one of them. When they've gone astray, because they have. Remember this angel they have before the face of the Father, and then we get this example of God's concern for going after them. So I quite like that. Your other suggestion doesn't really go along with this one very well, but I like that too. I mean, I could see an ancient interpreter looking at it that way, that like, don't you mess with these little ones, because these angels of vengeance are going to get you.
I mean, I guess one way to go that way is to go in the vindictive angel way, is to tie it to what came before. With, you don't...
millstone and everything.
You don't cause one of the little ones to stumble, and then you don't yourself sin. So maybe the sinning is sinning in a way that causes one of the little ones to stumble. I mean, I'm being a little bit ornate probably in my reading, but if you tie it with what comes before, then it's like, don't despise one of these little ones, or else you have these enforcer angels.
Yeah, because these paragraph divisions aren't in the original text.
Right.
And if you read that with the paragraph before instead of the paragraph it's currently in, it does maybe push you in that direction in terms of reading it in that way. Yeah, that's a good point. Well, let's move further into chapter 18. So Jesus gives instructions for how to handle when someone sins against you. So first you're supposed to deal with it between you and the offending party alone. And if they listen, great. And it says you have regained that one. But if not, then you have to take it to one or two other people. If the person still doesn't listen, then the matter goes to the church. And then it says if it still is not dealt with, the person doesn't repent, then they are treated as a Gentile and a tax collector. So what does it mean to treat someone, for Matthew, like a Gentile and a tax collector? And then what does it mean when it says in verse 18, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven?
Great questions. So first I want to mention that there's a really important textual variant that changes a lot here in verse 15. So some manuscripts we would translate, if your brother sins, go and do all this stuff. And others add two words in Greek, which would make it, if your brother sins against you. And it's hard to decide which one Matthew is more likely to have said. And I mention it because there actually aren't that many really interesting textual variants in Matthew, and this is one of them. Are we dealing with a case where somebody just sinned? Like I see that guy sinning, I'm going to go get him. Or is it, something against you? It's, like it.
Yeah.
Pretty different scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
So to become as a Gentile or a tax collector, Gentiles or the nations, non-Israelites are consistently the other, the outsider in Matthew's gospel. They're used as an example in the Sermon on the Mount of how not to act, or just sort of an ordinary way of acting that's not particularly impressive. And tax collectors are like your chief kind of sinner. I mean, I don't know, for us it'd be like what would it be? Corrupt Wall Street bro or something. So your signal kind of sinner. So to treat them as Gentiles and tax collectors, that would mean that they're outsiders. Probably not irrevocably lost, though, because Matthew also has a big emphasis on the gospel going out to the nations and also going to sinners like tax collectors. But they would be in that category. They would be in the category of people who needed to be rescued.
And it's striking to read this in the context of the parable of the lost sheep right before it, right? And so then we can read this and see this maybe as a means through which those lost sheep are brought back into the fold. You go through this process to try and do that.
That's exactly right.
What about the binding and the loosing part? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's tricky. So in context, it seems to be, refer most immediately to the decision to eventually treat them as Gentiles and tax collectors. So there's an authority that's exercised by the community, two or three gathered in Jesus's name. That means Jesus is actually among them, and sort of with the authority of Jesus or presence of Jesus, they are able to decide that this person is unrepentant and they're sinning, and they are going to be treated as a Gentile or a tax collector. So in that sense, it looks to me to be pretty similar to a saying in John 20, when the risen Jesus confers on the disciples the authority to forgive or retain sins. So it looks like something like that. So acting in Jesus's name, they're able to decide, what to do with sinner, or perhaps also how to try to work together to try to rescue that person. We should probably mention that there's a parallel in Matthew 16, where Jesus is only talking to Peter, and that's the famous, on this rock I will build my church. He's given the keys of the kingdom of heaven, which you bind, bound in heaven, and seen. Maybe that means something similar that can refer to forgiveness. A lot of scholars think that also has teaching in view, sort of deciding what counts as sinning, what counts as a necessary obedience. So the two are closely related: authoritative teaching and kind of forgiveness and discipline. Another passage, if you're interested in this, to get to the bottom of it, that I would suggest looking at would be Matthew 23, where Jesus is talking to this or excoriating scribes and Pharisees, and he thinks that they have real authority sitting on the seat of Moses, and talks about how they bind heavy burdens on people and basically prevent their salvation. So probably what we have here is a kind of shift in Matthew's mind and Matthew's circles of the kind of the authority that they believe that the scribes and Pharisees exercised to the ecclesia, or the church gathered around Jesus to sort of teach and discipline authoritatively.
Interesting. In response to this, Peter then asked Jesus how many times then he is supposed to forgive his brother, to which Jesus responds, not 7, but 77 times. And then Jesus tells the parable of the unforgiving servant. Now, can you walk us through this parable? And we have economic language here, right?
Yep.
And what's the significance of this parable in the economic language that we find here?
Okay. Well, the gist of the parable in a nutshell is, I would suggest, a kind of narrative expansion or explanation of the famous line in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts, or, a lot of people say trespasses was a terrible translation. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And then there's a nice little explanation at the bottom of it in Matthew 6, using language more like trespasses. So just that you understand that we're not just talking about literal debts. So it's a way of tying God's forgiveness of you to your forgiveness of others. And before we even talk about the parable, you could just jump to punchline in verse 35, where Jesus says, thus also, so whatever I just said, this is the point, your heavenly Father will do to you if each of you do not forgive his brother from your heart. So this is what's at stake is the obligation that is imposed on you if you receive divine mercy, to go show similar mercy. So in the parable, begins with a king settling accounts with his servants. Settling accounts is a recurring image of the kind of the Last Judgment in Matthew. Not contemporary Christians' favorite image, but it's a one that shows up repeatedly in Matthew. He's settling accounts. He finds a servant that owes him. My preferred translation of the amount that he owes him is $1 bazillion, or like a gazillion dollars. Sometimes scholars will try to specify exactly how much this was, and it's totally pointless because the unit that's used, talent, varied in time and place, and the amount is just incalculable. So like more than you could possibly ever imagine. That's the point. He owes that much. And so the king is going to sell him and his wife and children in order to make payment, which is interesting. He begs for mercy, and the king says, fine, I forgive you everything. No big deal. Then the guy goes and finds a fellow servant who owes him just a tiny amount and refuses to show mercy to him when he asks for it, and has him thrown into prison until he should repay all that he owes. The king finds out about it and says, I think an important verse is verse 33. Was it not necessary for you to show mercy to your fellow servant as I showed mercy to you? That's kind of the point, Matthew. And so then the Lord, he's called there, he's enraged, and he hands him over to the torturers, and he's thrown into prison until he should repay all that he owes. So again, I think the point is, Receiving mercy obliges one to show a similar mercy to others. That's an important idea for. Now, one of the things that really interests me about this is all these references. So this is just kind of a social historical question. I think so. Exegetically, I think for Matthew, that's what it is. Some people try to get around it because they don't like it theologically, but sorry, I don't know. An interesting question here that fascinates me is all these references to loss of freedom in order to repay a debt. We have the sale of a family to repay a debt, thrown into prison to repay a debt, or thrown to the torturers until a debt can be paid. There's a similar reference to something like this in Matthew 5, verses 25 and 26, where you can be thrown into prison until you repay the last penny that you owe somebody else. I did my very best a few years ago to try to figure out how this actually worked in antiquity. And as far as I can tell, I mean, there were lots of attempts to make imprisonment or debt slavery illegal, but people kept doing it. And the reason was it's a great way to just coerce people to pay. So I don't think you don't pay by suffering itself, but if you're thrown into prison, you would be quickly motivated, say, to liquidate any remaining assets that you had, or to get a friend to bail you out, that sort of thing. So I think that's what's envisioned here. In ancient Christian commentary, people go crazy with these references to repaying all that you owe in prison, and they take it in a kind of you might call it like a purgatorial direction, where post-mortem punishment could eventually, like maybe you'd get out of prison. But I don't think that's what Matthew actually has in mind. I'd mention it anyway.
So, Nathan, we told you at the top, well, you asked for mercy at the top on this marriage question in chapter 19, but let's just talk briefly about it. What's the basic conflict here as the Pharisees bring this question to Jesus and Jesus responds to it?
So the question, they ask him whether it's lawful to divorce for any reason. And scholars usually interpret this with reference to a debate that we find in later rabbinic literature between two different schools of interpretation, one of which said you can divorce a woman really basically, because she cooked badly or anything. And the other that interpreted a line from Deuteronomy to mean it had to be something like some kind of like serious like sexual infraction. Mm-hmm. And so it's plausible that something like that is in the background here. And what Jesus goes on to say then, following the parallel in Mark, is that God has joined the two together. They are one flesh. Humans can't separate that. So he seems to just deny both. And that's what we see across the New Testament from Jesus. It's just no divorce. Marriage is indissoluble. But then, as I mentioned earlier, and this is why I begged for mercy, he goes on to add this exception clause in verse 9. And that can mean a number of different things that maybe we don't. But in general, anyway, for Matthew, as the rest of the New Testament, marriage is God has joined it together. It's permanent. Then the disciples object. I mean, this sounds terrible. if there's no out, maybe we should get married. And we get this eunuch saying, which is only found in Matthew. That word could describe somebody who is, a castrated, say, court official, or somebody who's just incapable of conceiving children. Here it seems to be applied in a number of different ways, including those who decide to become eunuchs for the kingdom, seemingly like embrace a life of celibacy. Mm-hmm. And so traditionally this is read along with a passage in 1 Corinthians and this is where you get the ancient Christian fascination with celibacy. Note, however, I'll just say one last thing. It's often people take this to mean there's another way, like, if you don't like marriage, try being a eunuch, like as a separate path, and maybe something like that is in view. But I think also if Jesus' teaching on marriage is followed, inevitably you're going to have a lot of people living as celibates who started out married, because if the marriage goes sour and there's no out, so it's the logic of these two parts that I think is a little closer. That would be another kind of eunuch for the kingdom.
They become eunuchs because they
can't marry anyone else.
They can't marry anyone else, so they get divorced. But they
can't get divorced.
Or they can't get divorced. They just live as though they were unmarried. So in practice, obviously many marriages, ancient and modern, end up for a million different reasons going down the tubes. Sure.
And if we're not in a situation where there's the possibility of remarriage,
okay,
and all that's left is living celibately. That's
right. I guess what I'm asking is that, but has he foreclosed the divorce altogether?
Well, that's the question. I haven't worked on this recently, but I think there's three main options for that in verse 9 and the parallel in 5 is at 3:2. So it's either the exception clause in case of fornication or however you translate it. Some would take it to mean if there's porneia, all bets are off. You can start over. Okay. Control Alt Delete. That's one. That's one that obviously a lot of people favor. A lot of Christians favor because otherwise this you have the same reaction of the disciples, like, man, if this is true, don't get married.
Yeah.
Another option is that it refers to the sort of the separation. In other words, if you have porneia, yes, like divorce, but you still can't get remarried.
You live another way. Then.
Yes. And then another interesting proposal that's on the table from a number of Jewish parallels is that in case of porneia, you're actually required to divorce or separate. That it's no longer lawful for you to stay together. I still can't make up my mind.
Sure.
The problem I have with the idea, and we're talking about this longer than we said we were going to, the problem I have with the idea that much beloved by many interpreters, that this just means all bets are off, is I don't see how what Jesus, that would be basically a reversal of the earlier teaching. And Jesus would be squarely in these sort of established line of interpretation. It would be a reversal of what Jesus says in Mark. And then why then the reaction from the disciples?
Right, sure. Great. Okay, well, in verses 13 through 15, we get what appears to be a digression about children. And so we read that then little children were being brought to him in order that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples spoke sternly to those who brought them, but Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs." And he laid his hands on them and went on his way. It seems to come out of nowhere, right? It's right in between the teaching on marriage and divorce, and then right after this we get the rich young man. Is this like just kind of, why is this here? Is there some rationale or no? What do you think?
Yes. So the Matthew is like a film editor where on set you shoot a bunch of different scenes and you're not maybe even sure where they're all going to go. And then the way you finally tell the story is in the order of the scenes. With students, my favorite example of this is the baptism sequence in the first Godfather movie, if you've seen that, which is spliced together with a bunch of murders. Baptism, murder, baptism, murder. So here we have another saying, another tradition of Jesus and the children, but it's put here alongside of other traditions about children, greatness disputes, passion predictions, and as I suggested earlier, I think the point is to draw the mind of the reader back again to children, to remember that, such as these, the kingdom belongs. This is it's an image of the kingdom or of Jesus himself.
So verses 16 to 30, then, we have this rich young man who comes to Jesus. And as an expert on economic language in Matthew and the Gospels, I want to hear how you would interpret this passage. What's going on here? What is Jesus communicating through his engagement with this young man?
Yeah, so great question. So the young man wants to have eternal life. What must he do to have eternal life? Christian readers would expect Jesus to say, well, you can't do anything to acquire eternal life. But instead, Jesus says, well, keep the commandments. Focusing on the second table of the Decalogue, the interpersonal part, and then capping it off with love your neighbor as yourself from Leviticus. Then, it goes on, even to say, if you desire to be perfect or complete, sell all that you have, give to the poor, have treasure in heaven, and then come follow me. So Jesus here, is Jesus going beyond what the Torah says or what the Old Testament says? From a kind of a literal angle, obviously yes. But in Matthew's world, it's important to remember that the only way to understand the scriptures is alongside of Jesus or through Jesus. So for Matthew, this is bringing out what it means to love your neighbor as yourself and to be complete. So what it requires essentially, so starting with the 10 Commandments, but then when you really get into their inner essence, according to Matthew, it's total abandonment, complete abandonment to the gospel, to Jesus. That's what attains eternal life. There's a question so does that mean, this is one of the age-old questions, does that mean that every single follower of Jesus, according to Matthew, needs to give up everything that they have? Well, unless Matthew was really clumsy and just kind of dumb, which he wasn't, no, because we have, say, Joseph of Arimathea, who's explicitly described as a disciple and as rich in Matthew. So it can't mean that. But it also can't mean that this is the path to salvation just for this one guy, that this was a one-off, because everything in this passage echoes teaching of Jesus elsewhere in the Gospels. The language of completion, of treasure in heaven, of giving up all that you have, of renouncing everything, radical renunciation as the path to life. Matthew never stops talking about this. So I think the point here is probably that while maybe not every disciple literally liquidates all their assets, total renunciation in the sense of true willingness and the, sort of the practice of giving up everything for the gospel just is the way of life.
Yeah, interesting. The I mean, it's interesting also that Peter will then later reply, right? Look, we have left everything and followed you. So, like, unlike this, this rich young man, you know, we've done it, right? So it's almost like Peter takes it as a command not only to him, but that's incumbent on all disciples. Though I think you're suggesting there's more nuance to be had there. I really like your suggestion that that what Jesus is basically telling him is that you are not actually loving your neighbor as yourself. In his refusal, it seems like, to not sell his possessions and then to give to the poor, that's a violation of the law, which I think is fascinating. But also the refusal to follow Jesus is also there too as well. It's almost like he's refusing to become a disciple. Is that a good way to put it, you think? Or
yeah, I think that's exactly it. I mean, to receive the summons. So Jesus, according to Matthew, is very generous to people who err, as we discussed earlier. But to receive the call to take up one's cross and to just say no, that's not a good place to be. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think he is refusing to become a disciple.
So we need to get to chapter 20, but before we do, we just have to address this one issue, which is there's this famous saying here: it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God, right? Yeah. Now, does that refer to a particular gate called the Camel Gate, which camels had to kind of crawl through to get into Jerusalem?
Well, you probably know what I'm going to say, because I suspect everybody who teaches the Bible has to go through this with students over and over. No, it doesn't refer to a gate. That's a kind of happy legend, a way of avoiding the plain sense of the passage. If it's any consolation, the manuscript tradition of this passage and its parallels shows attempts by copyists, who copied the manuscripts, to soften the blow in some way. But no, sadly, it's just another fantastic synoptic image, over-the-top image, camel through the eye of a needle. The point is, it's impossible. You can't do it. Money is a killer, according to Matthew. This is something that this isn't a one-off. You can't serve both God and money. Those who are stingy, their whole existence is thrust into darkness. All of that is in chapter 6. Clearly, Matthew thinks you can do good things with money, and you find that elsewhere in the New Testament too. The analogy I like is that money in the Jesus tradition is like radioactive material. You could do really good stuff with radioactive material. You might really help people with it. But if you sleep with it by your bed, you're toast. So it cannot boil down, as it does in so much preaching, to a matter of pure interiority either. Like, just don't be attached. Mm-hmm. In the world of the Gospels, if you just hang on to your money, you are attached. And then you can't serve God.
Yeah, so, I mean, the economic language then, right, that we see here is, if you wish to be complete or whole, go sell your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, then come follow me. So by giving to the poor, he has treasure in heaven. So does the economic language suggest that that he can purchase his way into heaven, would you say? Is that kind of the thrust of the language?
Well, so the Gospels are happy to talk about things like repayment from God that is apparently synonymous with receiving eternal life, with wages with God, treasure in heaven, settling of accounts. Matthew and the early church generally was not nervous about this stuff in the way that we are. Moreover, to continue maybe with the bitter pill, the economic language in Matthew is not merely ornamental. It's not just something that is there because it's traditional or something that you could set aside. it really structures a lot of the things that Matthew says at a fundamental level. I mean, even say in the very Lord's Prayer, and how disciples pray for forgiveness. Having said that, though, Matthew, like other early Christian and Jewish texts that use this kind of economic language, this is the conceptual register that Matthew uses to describe divine generosity and mercy. So I think it's important not to just see the economic stuff and panic, as in my opinion, many interpreters have done in the last few hundred years, but to slow down and try to understand what Matthew is actually doing with it. And so in this passage, yes, Jesus says to Peter, yeah, you're going to receive this fantastic repayment, so will anybody else, even unto eternal life. And then goes on to tell the parable of the workers of the vineyard, which adds something to this, which is very, very much right in the mainstream of early Jewish and Christian discussions of how God treats people. And goes on to describe God as an employer who pays people. There's a settling of accounts again, but God who is irritatingly generous to people who have done less. So yes, repayment, but it's fantastically generous repayment.
Yeah, and that parable is told to reinforce this phrase that Jesus gives both at the end of chapter 19 and then again at the end of the parable. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. So what's so important about that phrase? It gets repeated. We get the parable to explain it to us.
Yeah, so that's Matthew's way of making sure that we understand that the parable belongs. So this is a place where the medieval chapter divisions aren't very helpful for us. This is Matthew's way of trying to tell us that 19 and 20 belong together here, and that you can't understand the interaction with the rich young man and the disciples unless you also read the parable. Last first last shouldn't be taken as a literal, like the best disciples will actually be the worst, or even like cast into the outer darkness, but as more of a kind of a slogan, meaning be careful, you're dealing with God, you don't know which way is up. God is going to be so generous that when you're reading the parable and there are people who worked all day and they're mad about people who didn't work as much, you might think of someone like Peter who said, well, look, we did all this stuff. I mean, my own opinion is that this functions as a kind of a gentle warning to someone like Peter not to begrudge God's generosity to those who have done less. It's like Matthew's version of the parable of the prodigal son, when you have the in Luke, the older brother who gets grumpy about the forgiveness shown to the younger brother.
Yeah, great. Now, while they are on their way to Jerusalem, Jesus tells the disciples that the Son of Man will be crucified and then raised on the third day. And here we have actually repeated Son of Man language. And then we read of this exchange between the mother of the sons of Zebedee and Jesus. And she asks Jesus to set one of her sons on Jesus' right hand and one on his left hand in his kingdom. Now, the other disciples get upset. They get angry with the brothers about this. I mean, isn't it the mom's fault? I don't know. But they're upset with the brothers, and then Jesus intervenes by saying a few things, including this. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, I think you point out in your book that this is actually economic language as well, that I had never thought of as economic language. So could you unpack that saying that many of us are familiar with, but what is Jesus doing with it? How is, him being Son of Man and the ransom language functioning as he responds?
So this passage is the last time before Jesus enters Jerusalem, where again, we have a dispute about greatness. James and John have grasped the part about thrones, which came up in chapter 19. They want to rule with the Son of Man. This is imagery taken by Matthew from Daniel 7. We have the Son of Man ruling and all the nations serving him. James and John say, yes, excellent, we like that part. We want to do that. And then again, we come back to this question of status. So Jesus is trying to explain what this means for them and for himself over and over and over and over. This is his last attempt. And he says, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, which is kind of a reversal of the imagery in Daniel 7, where all the nations are serving the Son of Man. So he can reverses it a bit and says, actually, it's his vocation not to be like the Gentiles who lord it over others, but to be a servant. And the way that he's a servant, this is where we get the ransom saying, specifically, he gives his life on the cross as a ransom, or to pay the ransom for many. A lot of Matthean scholarship or commentary has tried to dismiss the theological significance of this saying on the grounds that ransom just means like kind of a general release or redemption of some kind without specifying anything. And the point that I try to make in the book is that the noun that's used here refers to some kind of price of release. It doesn't refer to just a redemption in general. So this is a traditional saying. Matthew takes it over from Mark. There are other similar sayings across the New Testament. The idea that Jesus in some way earns or pays a ransom as part of the salvific work he does for people. In the context of Matthew, I think probably the most plausible thing for that to mean in Matthew is what Matthew said over and over and over, that the people are in debt because of their sin. They're in bondage, they're in a kind of exile, and they need redemption. And the way that Jesus redeems them is by giving his life, by doing the behavior that he teaches the disciples over and over, earns treasure in heaven, earns the ransom price for their debt. This isn't worked out into any kind of, elaborate systematic soteriological theory, like, probably people's brains jump to that. But in the context of Matthew, it's, people are crushed by the debt of their sin, and Jesus has come to save them from that by this act of obedience. Interestingly, it's also something that occurs in the context of exhortation. So he's telling the disciples also, and this is the way of life that's set out for you as well. So it's not what Christians tend to think of as just this is just what Jesus does, and you just receive it, and nothing else happens. It's also set out for them as what it means for disciples is to go and do something, likewise, even if it's not identical.
So just connecting this back to the parable of the unforgiving servant in verse 27, when that servant asks for pity, it says, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. Is there any connection between that language used there and this ransom language here?
Well, I think so. A ransom could be used to describe, something that you pay to somebody who, for example, somebody who's been thrown into prison or has been taken prisoner or enslaved. You could pay to enslave them. So it comes from a similar thought world. I think, I don't know if this is quite what you're getting at, but in Matthew we have what is for a lot of modern people a confusing combination of sayings about Jesus's kind of vicarious action saving others here, and in chapter 1 he will save his people from their sins, along with things like the parable of the unforgiving servant, where forgiveness seems to be contingent on certain actions on the part of followers. And the way that I would read those together is just that chapter 18, refusal to forgive someone else is for Matthew basically synonymous with just rejecting that ransom payment, that freedom from bondage.
Great. Now, the one quick last comment, maybe to hear what you think about this, is that, like we saw at the beginning of chapter 18, there's a child that comes up that Jesus kind of offers as this object lesson, right, of what it means to be great in the kingdom. And then in chapter 19, in the middle of that, again, we get, children again, right, that you have to be like children. And then, so is a lot of the stuff intervening in here then, including the sons of Zebedee, who are trying to be greatest in the kingdom. One is Matthew kind of showing, okay, this is not, they're failing in their kind of call to discipleship to be like children. They're trying to achieve a high status, which, as you said, children kind of embody this low status. And then on top of that, I wonder also if the rich young man, if he's kind of also clinging to his high status, right? So he's not attaining the lowly status of a child in the kind of the divestment of his possessions. What do you think of that? Is that a good way to tie those things in, or would you want to put it similarly or differently?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. So really across the Synoptic Gospels, from when Jesus begins teaching about the cross through to the end, Jesus returns to this sort of question of like, what does the cross mean for him and for disciples? What does this mean for how you live your life? What does this mean for status? And no one ever really gets it. So the rich man, I mean, that's just why money is dangerous. It's status, it's power. It's hard to let go of. James and John, they're the sons of Zebedee. They got the part about the thrones, but they don't understand that these are the thrones of the crucified one. Even the language of sitting at Jesus' right and left foreshadows the language of the two people crucified on Jesus' right and left. It's not quite the same in Mark, and Matthew fixes that and makes it exactly the same.
Interesting.
So what Jesus is sort of saying here is to ask to reign with the Son of Man on one of his thrones is to ask to be crucified with him. And but none of the characters ever get it.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, and I feel like I've got so much more out of the text thanks to this discussion with Nathan. Last question we have for you is, do you have a blurb for us? So something that you might recommend, and it could be a book like those blurbs we're so familiar with, but it could be anything else, TV show, movie, life hack, or whatever.
Well, we're recording this on January 6th. And so my blurb is a New Year's tradition that I got from a friend in high school named Jim. If you hear this, give me a call. And that's to, on New Year's Day, get up. So it's called the New Year's Day 10-mile hangover run. You don't have to go 10 miles. You don't have to run. You don't have to have a hangover. It's better if you don't, actually. But the tradition is to get up really early. Everything's really quiet on New Year's morning, and run or walk about as far as you can. It's a fantastic way to start the calendar year, and I've been doing it since I was a kid, so that's my recommendation.
Did you run or walk?
I ran, but I confess that this year, for the first time in a while, I did not make it 10 miles.
Oh, okay. All right. Age catching up with you, maybe. All right. Well, the New Year's Hangover Run is our blurb for this week. And you can apply that. You don't have to do it on New Year's. You can pick another day. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you again, Nathan. Thanks for walking us through this text and all of the difficult and fascinating issues that arose there. We saw over and over again this idea of the final accounting in economic language. Matthew is traditionally considered to be a tax collector himself, so he's probably familiar with this kind of economic features. You know how you do an accounting for a podcast? You look at the reviews on Apple Podcasts.
That's true.
That's a way that people do this accounting. So we would appreciate if you contributed to the accounting for this podcast by taking a moment to go to Apple Podcasts, put a review in there, or just share this with someone else. And you know who would be a great person to share it with? Well, maybe not. But children, right? Children probably love it.
Probably not.
My children give me a hard time. They're like, let's listen to the two Testaments because we need to get to sleep. That's the reason you turn that on when we're on car trips, to get us to go to bed. So anyway, well, thanks again, Nathan. We appreciated it, and thanks for listening.
The Two Testaments is produced with support from Samford University, where Ronnie Cosman and Will Kynes are professors in the Department of Biblical and Religious Studies. Thanks to you, our fellow travelers, who support this journey by donating on our website, thetwotestaments.com. Thanks also to Cam Thomas, Joe Zelder, and the team in the Samford Faculty Success Center, and our student assistants for their help with production, editing, and promotion.